Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Detroit Institute of Arts Thursdays at the Museum program. I'm Christine Mark, the DIA's Manager of Volunteer Development. Thank you for joining us for this virtual screening of Mandabi in celebration of Black History Month. This special event is limited to the first 300 guests. In the comments box is a link to the film and a special password. This link will only be valid for the rest of today and tomorrow. To introduce the film, Community Engagement Manager Amanda Harrison is joined by our Film Curator Elliot Wilhelm. If you'd like to ask a question during the program, please select the Q&A icon in the right side of your screen and type it in. Elliot Wilhelm has been the director of the Detroit Film Theater series at the Detroit Institute of Arts since 1973 and has held the title of Curator of Film at the DIA since 1984. One of the most acclaimed and best attended film programs in the nation, the DFT has been visited by more than 4 million moviegoers in the last 45 years. I would now like to please give our hosts a very warm welcome.
Thank you, Christine, and thank you to those of you watching at home. We're honored to have you with us today for this very special program. I wanted to start out by just saying we have so many offerings for our Black History Month celebration. If you'd like to check out more, we have that available to you at dia.org/Black History Month. So deeply funny, engaging, and powerfully indignant, Mandabi is a richly iconic depiction of a society scared by colonialism and plagued by bureaucracy and corruption. Director Ousmane Sembène has a reputation of being the father of African film. Elliot, what inspired you to share it with us today?
Hi, Amanda. Thanks for having me, first of all. It's always a good occasion to show a movie by Ousmane Sembène. He was one of the world's great filmmakers and a real pioneer who told fabulous stories. And one of the things that really distinguishes him is that he's frequently called the father of African cinema, and there's really something to that, because the African feature film being exported to the rest of the world and also for domestic use was a pretty new concept when Sembène made his first feature film in 1965, a film called Black Girl, also known as Le Noir de, which translates to the Black Woman of, as if she were property. Before I really get into his history, you asked me what inspired this. Something very specific inspired the showing of this particular film, and that is Mandabi, which translates as the money order, was recently restored. Many of Sembène's films, even though all of them had been released in the United States, were in a kind of a distribution limbo, which meant that you couldn't see them in very good copies, and they weren't really able to make it into theaters again because the rights were in kind of suspension and there weren't really good physical prints of the films to show. Fortunately, people like Martin Scorsese and his Film Foundation have made a real crusade in the last 20 years of finding great movies around the world that are not necessarily commercially all that significant in terms of how much money they're going to make, but are works of art that for aesthetic or social or other reasons need to be preserved for future generations. And when you preserve a film now, when you make digital copies of it, one of the great things is that you have to make a beautiful 35 millimeter print as well to use as a kind of blueprint for what's going to follow digitally. And that meant that those films could be shown in theaters. Well, now that's pretty much all digital. We wanted to show this restoration of Mandabi, which was made in 1968, in the DFT. And of course, now that we're closed for the pandemic, the question was, do we wait until the DFT is reopened? And that still is a date uncertain at this moment. Or do we stream it, which we can do? And we did just stream it for general viewers last month and wanted to include it as part of Thursdays at the museum because it's such a key work from a continent that's not all that well represented, even in theaters that show foreign language and specialized films. So we wanted to make sure that happened. And
it is free. I just want to jump in and mention that viewers can watch it for free right now. It
is. And one of the other reasons, Amanda, as I had mentioned to you earlier, and as people will probably be able to see on the screen, is that 25 years ago, Ousmane Sembène was a guest at the Detroit Institute of Arts. His career was in full flower at that point, and he had a new film that was being released and came to the United States to promote it. And we were so excited about the possibility of bringing Sembène to the DIA and to the Detroit Film Theater program with his latest film at that time. This was 1996. That I offered to show a complete retrospective of all of his work to that time if he would stay a little bit longer. And as it turns out, he also agreed to be the guest of honor at that year's Bal Africain at the DIA, which was a fundraiser for the purchase of new African arts for the DIA. So the first film we showed in the retrospective was the film that you're going to see today, Mandabi from 1968. Sembène came to the theater. He talked to the audience. We had 1,000 people in the room. We showed his other films for the following 6 days. And it was one of the most memorable events in Detroit film theater history. And really on a personal level, one of the most memorable events in my life because he was so generous with his time and with his points of view. And he's was an absolutely fascinating individual. And I shouldn't say was because he lives through his films. The gentleman on the right is Ousmane Sembène as he visited. There's a shot taken at the DIA. The guy with the beard you may not recognize, but that's what I looked like a quarter century ago when my hair was dark and I was a little bit thinner and had a dark
Elliot,
beard.
I almost didn't recognize you. It's such a handsome.
I know you didn't.
You mentioned that when Sembène visited, it was an honor, I think, for the DIA and the DFT to have him here. But you mentioned that he was really captivated by the film theater and had a really nice time with you during your visit too. Do you think
we had a great time?
DFT?
Yeah, he loved the theater, and most of all, he loved the audiences. The audiences at the DFT were so responsive to his films, and he was so interested in answering questions. He spoke a little bit of English. French is his primary language, but the whole question of language we'll get into later, because I know you're interested in the fact that this film is in Wolof, is part of what Sembène is about, and it touches on his themes, which are in all of his films, and that is really about the impact of colonialism, and particularly here, European colonialism on African cultures. We've had exhibitions.
That, yeah. Elliot, because you did mention that the Wolof, this film being done in the Wolof language is significant. And when I watched the film, I honestly, my own ignorance thought that it was done in Arabic, but I was reading that he really made films, with Africans for African people and in their African language. Can you speak to the significance of his decision to do the Wolof language, and did he get any pushback for making that choice?
Well, this was all a part of who he was and what drove him to the cinema. He was the son of a fisherman, born in 1923, didn't finish school. He was thrown out for being annoying and for calling attention to himself and violating rules that were in place. And he worked also as a dock worker in Marseille, France. He had been drafted into the French army to fight the Germans in 1944 during World War II, as many Senegalese were. And at that time, he became quite, saturated with French culture and learning French because of the colonial occupation, as it were, of Senegal. In Marseille, he became something of an activist working on the docks. And it was in the 1950s that he first started to write. And he wrote a novel called The Black Docker. And he began to write a series of short stories as well. He wrote them in the language he knew best, which was French. Most of these stories were about the impact of colonialism on the people of Senegal, and very often in particular, the city of Dakar, which was his hometown.
So Elliot, if he was writing in French and really started as a novelist, how did he transition into film? What inspired him to do that?
Well, it's exactly the point here, is that he was saddened to discover that these stories that he had written, which were often fables or parables told in a realistic fashion about people who had, and we're talking now after 1960, after Senegal achieved independence from France. They didn't achieve independence from France in every manner. The legacy of colonialism, the legacy of bureaucratic corruption, the legacy of money being the most important thing, of exploiting peoples, and in a sense of that hierarchy which leads to a kind of slavery. If it's not literal slavery, then it's a kind of cultural, intellectual slavery. Semben's interest in telling these stories and trying to wake up the population of Senegal and of Dakar was not really working the way he wanted it to, even if the novels were also getting worldwide distribution. And the reason was that there was a very often an illiterate population that he was trying to reach. And the language, French, was not something that was really penetrating the audiences he wanted to reach. And at that time, there were many national languages in Senegal. Arabic was one of them. And there's a long list of what we could consider official languages. But Wolof was a language that kind of combined elements of all the others. And it was an ethnic language, kind of like Yiddish in a way. And he realized that if he was able to communicate his ideas in that language, that maybe he was going to be able to reach the audience he wanted to reach. And then he realized that because so many people didn't read, regardless of what language he was being translated into, the cinema was the way to do it, because everybody goes to the movies. And Semben always loved movies. He saw a lot of great foreign films, what we would call foreign films, French, Italian, neorealist films, and so on. When he was in Marseille, he went to art theaters and he saw every film he could possibly see when he was a kid, and loved the idea of cinema and studied it, and went to Moscow to go to film school. And when he returned, he was pretty astute with a camera, and he was given a camera as a gift and brought it back to Senegal with him. And that's when he made his first short films. And his first film, Black Row, which I mentioned a little bit earlier, won a big prize at the Cannes Film Festival in 1966. And 2 years later, this film, Mandabi, was completed. This film was designed to attract wider audiences. It was made in color. It's quite beautiful looking, and it's really seamlessly made. It's a beautiful, beautifully told tale, ironic, heartbreaking. It has an ending that's, I would say, a little more hopeful than perhaps Semben really intended it to be, based on having read the novella. But it was there so that it would get wide release, but he got his message across about what corruption, governmental and social, general corruption leads to. And it's about a guy who receives a money order. He's impoverished. He fancies himself a holy man, and gets a money order from a nephew of his who's working in France, and can't cash it because he doesn't have an identity card. And this idea of his not having an identity card and what he has to go through, losing almost everything he has, even though he has almost nothing, to try to obtain an identity card, becomes gradually, you see it becoming a sort of a metaphor for someone who no longer really has an identity, and what he tries to give up to get an identity, and what he's getting this identity for. And it's a kind of recognition of a population that is lost between their previous colonial masters and the corruption that followed even after they left, permeating the society he lives in. So it poses a big question to the viewers of the film. Who are you? And what do you want to be? What kind of future do you want? And what do you want it influenced by? And are you capable of changing the corruption that you see all around you? But he does it with humor.
Which is ironic, Elliot, because there's one part in this film that really stood out to me where you say he's lost his identity. There's, confusion in the country and finding your own self. And then there's his wives still cater to him throughout this film. He has two wives. It's never fully explained how he supports two wives with no job. But right. I just remember one scene stood out to me where there is a baby like crying outside, like sitting alone, playing with a doll, just in full tears, and his wives are inside like tending to the lead and treating him kind of like he's a baby. And it's kind of ironic to have this loss of identity, this corruption and bureaucracy, but then to still have what I think of as really traditional themes.
Yeah,
Did you notice?
Yeah. And abusive relationships tend to spawn abusive relationships, and people who are powerless very often become abusive. And who is that always taken out on? It's always taken out on women in any society. And what Semben portrays, and always felt closest to through his whole life, he felt very close to his mother. All of his relationships with women have been the most intellectually stimulating, according to everything that he has written. And when you see his films, women are the strongest characters, and they generally do cater to men who are not particularly insightful, shall we say, in order to survive, in order to live. And I think there's one of the many reasons that Semben's films have achieved such popularity worldwide, not just on the African continent, is that there's kind of something familiar about that, about women
some
having
reoccurring
to praise a man as being great and brilliant and wonderful, even though he's clearly not, even though he's a bully, and even though he has not had a job for 4 years. He's yelling at his two wives for not having enough food on the table. For the first thing he does in the film when he does get some food is gorge himself to the point where he's in pain, and then he blames them for not waking him up so that he can go to his prayers on time. There's always somebody to blame, and this vicious cycle in the film is indeed comic in some ways, but it's also it rings so true that his films have stood the test of time for many, many decades now. And when you look at them now, they don't look like historical artifacts. They look
he did a great job.
Cautionary tales, yeah.
Yeah, he did a great job pitting like class against class in this film too, which I think resonates, across cultures and across time. There's one line that I wanted to mention in this film where he says, "Honesty is a sin in this country." That really stood out to me. And I wonder if Semben thought of himself as an activist or played a political role during his lifetime.
Yes, he did. I mean, he wanted to. He was a labor organizer at one time earlier in his career when he was working on the docks in Marseille. And he wanted to make people aware of the bondage that they were in, whether it was physical bondage or economic bondage, and that they had the power, if they wanted to unite and break out of authoritarian regimes, even if those regimes were self-imposed and left as a blueprint on their culture by previous colonial masters. He was an activist in the sense that he wanted his stories to inspire people. They weren't, poster art. They weren't kind of socialist realism. They were actually entertaining stories that were designed to infuse people with a new way of looking at the realities around them. There's a clear reason that his favorite American filmmaker was Charlie Chaplin. He talks reverently about the early silent Chaplin films and also about Modern Times, which is about Chaplin's little tramp finding himself in a modern society, unable to get work, having this emotional bond with this poor woman that he meets, being arrested for being a communist. All of these things happen to Chaplin in the film, but Modern Times is hilarious, but it's also frightening, and it's about an industrialized society, society in which people have to conform, and a society in which this little character, the little tramp that Chaplin was so famous for playing, almost gets defeated, but doesn't. And what Semben admired most about Chaplin was that character, the little tramp, refused to be defeated, even if he ended up poor, even if he ended up without the girl, even if things didn't work out in a traditional happy movie ending sense. He was unbowed, the little tramp, and always went on to the next adventure and the next day, in addition to being a cinematic genius and a great performer. And this is the thing that Semben admired about him so much and felt a kinship with, and said when he met Chaplin, it was one of the most electrifying moments in his life. It's not to say the films are Chaplin-esque, but they share a spiritual quality and spiritual values that are absolutely real, and you can feel them.
That's such an interesting connection to make for our audience, Elliot. Thanks for sharing. And if you've just joined our audience or are not aware yet, I want to remind everyone that a link to the film, if you want to go and watch it, it's password protected, but we have a link with that password shared in our chat box right now. And if you have any questions about the film that you'd like to ask, please feel free to drop us a question. And Elliot said he's happy to answer anything. So did you agree to that, Elliot?
I sure did. Yep. I'll be sorry for it, but nevertheless. And I'll tell you, Amanda, before this thought drains out of my head, talking about how relevant all of his films are, regardless of subject matter, there is probably nobody who could watch Mandabi right now about a man desperately trying to do one thing, to cash a money order, to achieve this one thing, and the obstacles, bureaucratic and otherwise, that are thrown in his way seem at first like, why, that's absurd, that all of those things couldn't possibly happen. Ask some of the people who tried to file for unemployment benefits relatively soon after the pandemic started. Ask what it was like to be on one of those phone trees, voicemail. Ask what it was like to try and sign up if you're over 65 to get a COVID vaccination now. You're going to feel like the central character in this film, Mandabi, made in 1968 in a land far away, about different subject matter, but with exactly the same dilemmas and exactly the same questions and exactly the same rage that this character ultimately finds himself, I shouldn't say wallowing in, but exploding in. And yet his feeling of impotence, and by the way, Semben made a film called Impotence, or Khala, years later, which was about an authoritarian character who acts the way he does because he is impotent in terms of ideas and in other ways as well. And it's one of his great satires. He only made 9 feature films, but they're all distinctive and all brilliant.
And having these timeless themes is probably what's kept him relevant all these years, I would imagine, and why he's the respected director that he is. You don't have to be from Africa or unable to cash a money order to relate to this film, is what it sounds like.
Yep, that's one of the reasons that he's still relevant. And the other is that he's a great storyteller. And he manages to put together characters and scenes in which people have disagreements or arguments. And in one of his greatest movies, Cheto, there are numerous scenes in which people have arguments with their God, and they come down in human form, and they debate issues back and forth. And it's absolutely fascinating, the straight ahead, straightforward way in which Sembène shows these things. He doesn't bother with special effects or anything of the kind. He strips all of those things away and makes his film about the characters. And what's really astonishing after you see a movie like this is to realize that almost all the actors in Mandabi and in most of his other films were non-professionals. They were people who he just met, auditioned, they'd never acted before, and he directed them in these sort of naturalistic but really wonderful performances. And many of the actors in this film went on to be in other Sembène films and then other African films as well. But he didn't have the money to hire professional actors. And from that lack of money came genius, because you need genius to get around the problem of not having money. It's one of the reasons he loved writing was that you could just sit down and write. You didn't need machinery. You didn't need to pay for all the equipment and so on. So movies were a big step and kind of a risk, but he wanted to reach a wider audience. And to the end, he felt literature was his real calling and writing was the greater of the two arts. But he loved the movies, and he was always proud of the films that he made.
And it sounds like he enjoyed making an occasional appearance in them as well. Is there a scene in this film when we see Sembène himself?
Yes, and it's interesting how he cast himself in his very small role in Mandabi. There's a scene that takes place in a post office early on in the film, and post offices in Dakar had someone sitting at a desk who would write a letter for you, or would read a letter for you, or would translate for you. Because of the illiteracy rate, there was somebody there to do all of that for a small fee. And that person, the most literary person in the post office, turned out to be played by Sembène with his ever-present pipe. He had his pipe with him constantly when he was at the DIA. If you see any of his films, including Black
He
Rover,
wasn't smoking it in the DIA, though, was he, Elliot?
Of course not. No one was ever allowed to do that. No, he didn't actually light it, but he liked to have it. He liked to have it there.
Elliot,
but the reason he actually
question
took the
from
first
our
small
audience.
role in Black Girl was that he didn't want to pay an actor for that small role because he didn't have enough money. So he played it himself, and it soon turned into a kind of a trademark.
Well, he sounds very resourceful. And Elliot, we have a question actually from our audience. Vicky wants to know, did Sembène publish any books? Do you know some of the titles that maybe we could share with our audience?
Sure. I'm not selling them, but Sembène's stories, his novels, the Money Order or Mandabi began as a novella. It's still in print, as are almost all of Sembène's works, including a wonderful novel called God's Bits of Wood, which he never was able to turn into a film. But most of the films that he made were originally conceived of as literary works that he then turned into a film. And with Mandabi in particular, for me, it's fun to watch the film again now and read the novella, and see scenes that are exactly the same on screen, and others that are quite different, including the fact that when you're writing, the central character in this movie has a lot of introspective moments in which he's thinking about his fate, and he's thinking about it in very shallow ways. Generally, we get to hear his inner voice when we read Semben's novella, but he does not have narration. Wisely, I think, it doesn't have a narration in the film, but decides to let that play out strictly through what the characters say and do. We have to provide that inner voice. So for people who are planning on making movies or simply interested in the process, it's really wonderful to read his works and then see how he translated them into films, knowing that there's a different audience that is going to be absorbing the same story in a different way, and to try and get the same emotional and intellectual impact in both of those media is really a challenge. And here's somebody who is a shining example of how to do it. There's also a documentary that I would highly recommend, Amanda. It's on a streaming on a service called the Criterion Channel. In addition to some of Semben's films, they have a documentary that was made by John Singleton, who made Boys in the Hood years ago. And he was an admirer of Semben's, and we get to watch Semben teaching his film students in Dakar, describing how to set up a shot, describing how to capture the emotional essence of a particular moment, what makes a scene feel false, what makes a scene ring true, how you have to take editing and lighting into consideration when you're telling your story. It's a really rare opportunity to hear him discussing film and teaching students what it is that he has learned over his lifetime. So I highly recommend you track that down and take a look at it.
Well, Elliot, it sounds like you just made the selection for our next Thursdays at the Museum film choice.
Quite possibly.
I'm teasing, but in closing, I have just one last question, and you might have touched on this already, but what do you hope viewers will take away by watching Mandabi?
Well, in addition to the insights that the film offers about the horrible cycle of corruption and bureaucracy and how it trips up the best intentions, I hope, as a person who has exhibited movies for most of his, I was going to say adult life, but most of my life period, I hope people will take away that it's a big world out there. Over this last year, it seemed really small, but there are countries that are making films that some people will never see because they're subtitles, or they think they won't understand it, or the culture is going to be very different, the customs are different. You can, even if you don't feel like getting on an airplane now for obvious reasons and flying off to someplace, these films can transport you. They can transport you physically, and you can see new parts of the world. But a film like Mandabi will also make you feel very close to the rest of the world. It eliminates, to a large degree, that sensation of fear of the other, of xenophobia, of foreigners, and it makes us feel, even in rage against certain things, it makes us feel a kind of kinship with humanity in general around the world. That is what cinema is really great for, I think. It is truly, in my book, the universal language, and nobody demonstrates that more than Ousmane Semben did.
It really goes back to that relatability that you talked about earlier, Elliot. I think in, a private conversation, I even remember I mentioned one of the characters reminded me of my dad,
That's right,
so it
yeah.
does. It is a universal language. So I love that you shared that with our audience, and thank you for joining us today. This was a great conversation.
My pleasure.
And thank you to everyone watching at home. We really enjoyed having you today. I wanted to just remind you that a link to the film is available to you for the rest of today and all day tomorrow It is password protected, but it's free for you to watch and enjoy. So please watch that at your leisure, and we'll be back again next week, March 4th at 1 p.m. to take an in-depth look at how murals are created with our studio team. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you next week.